2009 is the 400th anniversary of Galileo turning his telescope to the sky. To discuss this is Dr Peter Slezak. He's from the School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of New South Wales. Dr Slezak, good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, Susie.
Tell me, what's the significance of this?
Well, the 400th year marks Galileo's use of the telescope, which was a very dramatic event for a lot of different reasons. One, not least of all, was the discoveries that he made. He saw things that nobody actually had seen before, which made a huge difference not only to the progress of science and astronomy, but also to the understanding of our place in the universe, and that had an impact on the conflict with the Church about the nature of science and the truth of the Bible.
Now, there was a very significant trial about this. Can you outline what happened?
Well, Galileo wrote a book in 1632 which wanted to present the arguments on both sides. On the one side was the Copernican system, where the Earth was moving both around its own axis and around the Sun. But the traditional position was the Ptolemaic and Aristotelian view, which was that the Earth was at the centre of the universe. Now, that was the view that also was thought to have been articulated in the Bible itself. The scriptures say things like the sun stood still when a miracle happened, and that suggests that the sun was moving. And so it looked like the Copernican system was in conflict with the scriptures. So the church figures cared a lot about that, and this was regarded as potentially heretical.
And so what happened?
Well, finally Galileo was brought to trial. It was provoked by various disgruntled philosophers, I should say, for my own profession, Aristotelians, who thought that their theories and their professional reputations were at stake. But also there was the serious questions about the conflict with the Church. So after a long process, he was actually brought to a trial by the Roman Inquisition. And there wasn't a charge as we would understand today. It was an interrogation, but at the end of it he was found guilty of what is actually a technical charge or finding, vehement suspicion of heresy. That was actually a technical charge. It wasn't just a suspicion of a charge, it was actually an accusation.
Was it because Galileo was ahead of his time and the Church was perhaps of that time?
I think it's fair to say he was ahead of his time, but it's important to understand that the case for Copernicanism wasn't clinched yet. It wasn't clear that the Copernican system was correct. The leading astronomers and scientists at the time didn't necessarily agree with Galileo. Clavius, the greatest mathematician and astronomer at the time, actually didn't move over to the Copernican model. He saw the observations that Galileo had seen through the telescope, crucial anomalies for the Ptolemaic system, the phases of Venus, the fact that Jupiter had moons. These were not consistent with the earlier Ptolemaic and Aristotelian picture. But still Clavius didn't change his mind, and rightly so. The story wasn't clinched really until Isaac Newton.
So I guess what we're talking about here is the conflict between church and science, and really there was no separation at that time, and that has changed since then.
Well, it hasn't completely changed because clearly the conflicts with the Bible are still current disputes. The question of Darwin and various other issues that raise biblical questions are still hot topics. But at the time, it's important to understand that Galileo tried to argue for the separation of what they called then questions of faith and morals. And he argued that the scriptures are not a scientific text and shouldn't be looked for questions about astronomy. But it wasn't that clear at the time. Certainly not just the leading theologians and church people, but even the scientists took the Bible seriously as a source of authoritative claims about the world. And so we look backwards and think that was a mistake, but at the time it wasn't clear.
And why was he singled out as opposed to other scientists like Copernicus?
Well, Galileo was singled out because he was pretty provocative. I think he kind of pushed the church very hard on this. He argued strenuously for his position until he was given an edict not to talk about it in certain terms. In 1616 he was prohibited from speaking except hypothetically. He was asked to consider it as though it was just some kind of mathematical fiction, and he couldn't discuss it, and he arguably went against that later. The 1633 trial was actually about what happened in 1616 when he was given a prohibition.
Now, in your classes as a philosopher, you teach your students about, you have a retrial. That's one of your coursework requirements. Tell me about that. Well, how did that come about?
I learned of this at a conference of educators once, many years ago, when they did something like a retrial, and it was a pedagogical device that was a way of illustrating many, many issues. One of the wonderful things about the Galileo affair is that it raises questions not only about science versus religion and the nature of science and scientific revolutions, it raises questions about, for example, authority and dissent, which is at least a large part of what that was about. And many of the questions are still open. And so a wonderful way to bring the subject to life is to put the issues to a retrial. And it works because there's a strong case on both sides. It's not as though Galileo, as is widely thought, according to the stereotype, to have been this poor guy who tried to tell the truth, and the terrible church simply just came down on him and threatened him with heresy. It turns out that the church had a strong case, and so a retrial is an important exercise that has arguments on both sides. Now, as for doing it as a trial, it's really just a lively way of doing history, where instead of just reading the documents and the sources that are available, you put them in the mouth of characters, people that are playing the roles. And so it's really just an exciting way to do history.
And this time, you're doing it with a special twist. Tell us about that. It's quite high profile.
Well, in this case, instead of using the students and academic staff as we used to, which has always been a lot of fun, we've got some very interesting people playing the parts and going through the exercise. We have the astronomer Fred Watson playing Galileo. His defence counsel is Julian Burnside, and the prosecution is Anna Katzmann. We have Bob Carr playing the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo de' Medici. So we have a very interesting group of people, including priests playing the role of the Pope and Cardinal Bellarmine. And this makes it very interesting because these are people that in real life have some related professional or role. And so this brings it to life in an interesting way.
So I understand you've got some very high-profile people also from the ABC.
We have indeed. We've got the science broadcaster Robin Williams. We have the Philosopher Zone broadcaster, who is also a philosopher, Alan Saunders. And of course Geraldine Doog from the Compass program is involved as well. So it's a very interesting group of people.
Now, one thing that is going to happen is that you're looking at, when the retrial, you're looking at it through the trial at the time. You obviously aren't taking it into the modern day. So what can you conclude from it? I mean, will the result be the same?
Well, in a sense, we are doing it as a modern trial. We're not actually rehearsing or replaying the way it happened in the 17th century. The reason for that is it wasn't really a trial, it was a kind of inquisition. He came in and he didn't know what the charges were, so it wasn't a trial as we understand it. But what we're doing actually is putting it into the context of a modern trial, effectively, with a jury and with prosecution and defence. So we're actually rerunning what was the case then, but in a modern context.
And do you know ahead of time what the conclusion is going to be?
No, we don't. It's not rigged. What makes it really interesting is precisely because the historical questions are hotly contested. The historians argue about many of the issues, whether he was justly found guilty of vehement suspicion of heresy, what the documents say. Many of the questions are open, and that's just the nature of the historical discipline surrounding Galileo. So that means it's a very interesting thing to actually replay, and we don't know the outcome. It'll be for the jury to decide, given the case that's made by the players, the so-called historians, in this case, on both sides.
So it will be a very exciting night on the 26th.
We'll
look forward to hearing the outcome. Now, history, of course, has judged Galileo very well and the church quite poorly. Why do you think that is?
History is very interesting because we tend to do it in hindsight. We tend to use our own standards of judgment, our own understanding of the truth to look backwards, but that can distort the understanding of what happened at the time. In the 17th century, for example, the truth of the Copernican theory wasn't known yet. It wasn't clinched yet. And so many of the scientists hadn't yet accepted Copernicanism. So we can't simply claim that Galileo knew the truth and was suppressed by the church. The questions of whether religious considerations, whether the scriptures are relevant, at the time they were still thought to be relevant, and so it's easy for us to look back and say that this was inappropriate of the church to impose on him the requirement to not contradict the scriptures in the literal meaning. These are hindsight judgments, and history can't be done properly that way. So if we go back to the standards at the time, the question remains open.
Okay, so what actually did happen in history is that he was found guilty, and what happened to him then?
The trial was actually a miscarriage of justice. He was betrayed. They had a kind of a plea bargain, and he was going to be allowed to get off more lightly. And they brought up documents and they falsified certain materials. And he was found much more harshly than was really warranted, I think. The vehement suspicion of heresy wasn't the most serious charge. There was formal heresy, which was the most serious, but it was a very serious charge. And whether that was justified or not is still, I suppose, arguable. Certainly he was pushing very hard against the regulations the church had for how the church decides matters. The Protestants were the ones that left it open for people to interpret the scriptures as they would like, but the church had very strict procedures about that. Coming from the Council of Trent and Cardinal Bellarmine, they insisted that it was the fathers of the church that decided how the scriptures should be interpreted. And one of Galileo's most important letters was telling the church how they should do this, and that didn't go down well.
So what happened to him? I mean, he was under house arrest, or did he continue with his science?
He was treated very leniently. During the trial, he wasn't kept in the dungeons of the Inquisition. He was kept in the ambassador of Tuscany's palace. And afterwards, he was confined to his house in Tuscany, in Arcetri, under house arrest, effectively. So it was a relatively mild punishment. But he was able to pursue his science, and he wrote his most important scientific work subsequently in 1638 about his physics and so on.
I mean, it's probably very hard to say, but do you think that had a big effect on other scientists at the time, that trial?
It did indeed. In fact, it had a chilling effect on many people. For example, Descartes suppressed his own work at the time in 1633 or thereabouts, having learned of Galileo's fate. So that had an effect. On others, it didn't have the same impact because they were out of the reach of the Inquisition. Kepler himself had made spectacular and important contributions to this story, and he was out of the reach of the Inquisition, so his work was an important part of the story.
Dr Slezak, we've talked about some of the high-profile guests, but we have missed one very important one. You've got the preeminent scholar about Galileo coming here. Tell us about that.
Yes, we're very lucky. We have Professor Maurice Finocchiaro coming from the University of Nevada. He's one of the most important figures in the Galileo scholarship. He's translated many of the works and written endless numbers of articles. So we're very fortunate to have him. He'll participate in the trial as an expert witness, and he's giving a public lecture just before the trial on the Galileo affair from 1633 until today.
Fantastic. We'll look forward to hearing more. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.